Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we'll understand about custom exceptions. Custom exceptions are those exceptions which are written by us. They are not provided by Java exception handling. Sometimes you may need exceptions which are meaningful to your business with some specific messages which are not available in JDK. So sometimes there will be situation when you need a very specific type of messages that are being thrown as part of your exception handling which are not provided by JDK exception handling. In that case, you need your own type of exceptions, and that will be called as custom exceptions. But it's always recommended to use all the given standard exceptions as much as possible. If you come to a situation where you are not getting a standard exception, then in that case you can create a one exception that will be called as custom exceptions. Whether to make a custom exception as a checked or an unchecked exception, that is a very tricky scenario, but by default it should try with making your custom exception as unchecked ones. Then later if you find that no, it should be handled during compile time, then you can make it as a checked exceptions one. But many times your custom exception should be a unchecked exception one. Never use exceptions to control application behavior. What does it mean? Sometimes many users want to implement a logic according to the output of an exception. If some exception is being thrown, then I will do this. Never do that. No, exception handling is a very expensive one because it needs to call the native methods to pass the stack trace and all. If custom exception is created by passing another exception, then always contain the original exception as a source. Use constructor which takes exception, then only message and string. So you try to use or create the exceptions which takes both exception and the message, not only the messages. Apart from no argument constructor, you try to provide a constructor which takes the failure message along with the throwable or the exception. So don't create a custom exception class which takes just the message as an constructor argument, but try to create multiple constructors which takes messages, throwable, and the exception itself as part of the argument of the constructor. We'll see an example. Suppose if we'll see in the right hand side, there is a custom exception driver class. Here we are calling a get employee name and we are passing an employee ID, and employee ID is 0. So if we are saying if the employee ID is 0 or less than that, suppose someone is passing an employee ID as 0 or less a negative number, in that case we want to throw an exception which is a custom exception, and that exception is invalid employee ID exception. No employee ID found. This is the message and this is the ID. And if you see this one here, we have a custom exception which extends runtime exception. And if we'll check here, this is our default constructor, and this is one constructor which takes the message and the employee ID, and this is one constructor which takes the message, throwable, and the employee ID. And this is the standard. This is how you should write the exception. It should take the message, throwable, and the ID. Here we are implementing the toString and get message. That's it on custom exceptions.